Oh yana hey ya we hey ya hey ya. Oh yana hey ya we hey ya hey ya. Oh yana hey ya we hey ya hey ya. In the first year that I was on the two-row on the Grand paddle, one of my functions there, or my role, was to do activities with the groups. So we did wasaze, we did dancing, we did singing, and it was the idea of inviting what was called the settler population into our community. And one of the things that I actually enjoyed was the time at the Ganada village in Brantford near the Mohawk Chapel, where we had an evening gathering after supper, and uh, the all the people came in and sat in a circle while I did a presentation and a talk. But it wasn't really a talk or a presentation. It was almost what you'd call a historical enactment. It was a pageant. So what I did was explain to them what happened. That 2 years after Confederation, Queen Victoria sent her son, the 19-year-old Arthur the Duke of Connaught, to Brantford, Ontario. And he stayed at the Kirby Hotel. And he also went deer hunting down at Long Point. But at a day, an entourage of all of the people from Brantford society came to the Mohawk Chapel. And at the Mohawk Chapel, there was a gathering of Six Nations people there as well, including John Smoke Johnson, the grandfather of E. Pauline Johnson, who borrowed his Indian name, or his native name, or his Ongwahuan name, his real name, Degahionwage. That's what she used, but that was his name. So on that day, Arthur the Duke of Connaught, and oh, by the way, this is not just from oral tradition here. A lot of this information comes from research that was produced by the United Empire Loyalists. And it was actually written thousands of miles away in the journals of Jane McGarry, a nurse in the St. Paul's Residential School at the Standoff Indian Reserve, who talked about these things and actually paid homage to the Six Nations in many ways. But she also describes the event, and here's how it was described there. On that day, our glorious prince was taken by the old chief and walked up and down the rows of the gathered people there, exhorting to them as he walked and singing. And then they sat our glorious prince down by a pail of water and took some white buckskin and wiped his eyes and wiped his ears and gave him a drink of that water. And then following this cleansing by the old chief, our glorious young prince stood up by the fire with strings of wampum and exhorted to the native people in their own language. Eki non yawa aguego na hodo we se wore me hondo wasne la de noche, which means, I have heard what you said to me, and that's how I will govern myself into the coming days. And the United Empire Loyalists said in their writing at that time, on that day, Canada was added as a rafter to the Longhouse of Many Nations. I used to wonder what that was about, because elders here, one in particular, Sylvanus General, had said, he was an elder, by the way, with what is called the Mohawk workers here, that if it wasn't for your people, Canada would not be a nation today. And I always scratched my head over that, what he meant by that. And when I found out by reading the United Empire Loyalists and looking at the newspaper reports, and there's even photography of that event that happened, what it meant is that Queen Victoria knew she needed to ask permission of Indigenous people from the honor of the Crown for Canada to exist as a nation separate from Britain, from England. And so Canada's rafter was added as to the Longhouse of Many Nations. Same as the Abenaki rafter, the Mi'kmaq rafter, the Nisga'a rafter, the Blackfoot rafter, the Ojibwe rafter, the Cayuga rafter. All those are rafters in the Longhouse from the east coast to the west coast. And as I was explaining this to the gathering there at the Ganada village during the paddle, I said the way they talk about it in our culture is that where the sun rises in the east is the eastern door, where it sets in the west is the western door, and the blue sky over our head is the roof of that long house, and all of us who live in that long house are one family. So when had the gathering, I actually invited one of the participants, and I can't remember his name right now, but I had him play the role of Arthur the Duke of Connaught, and I played the role of John Smoke Johnson, and led him around the gathering. And what I explained was happening was this, that wasn't explained in the United Empire Loyalists account of the day or not, which is this. When the chief led him around, he conferred a name, a native name, a Mohawk name on Prince Arthur. And those of us who come out of the Haudenosaunee or Ongwehoeneha traditions know that what happened was he was adopted. That was the adoption ceremony, where he went and introduced them to the men, to the women, to the elders, and to all the people. As somebody, now we take his name, Arthur, we bury it in the ground. Now we've hung a name around his neck. And that name was Garakonje. And Garakonje is a Mohawk Wolf Clan name. So we enacted that ceremony there, the adoption ceremony, and I explained that what happened with the adoption was he went from corner to corner the way they do when an adult is adopted at the Longhouse and given a native name, or they call it a name around the neck. And what that is that when a nation of people, an individual, a family, is endeared by the people of the Six Nations, they will hang a name around their neck and extend the rafters. They will move the rafters. And so moving the rafters meant adding Canada's rafter to the Longhouse of Many Nations. Right? And then the idea of him sitting down and having the white buckskin used to wipe his eyes, wipe his ears, and give him a drink is the condolence ceremony, the expression of compassion to remove any of the grief that might be carried by the individual when they come in. Now, this is an old tradition here because it was given to the lieutenant governors all the way back into colonial times in the United States. That was what happened. They were cleaned up, right? And then the last part of it is where you have the strings of wampum that the young prince then says, I've heard what you said to me, and that's how I will govern over myself into the coming days, is accepting then the Canadian rafter being added to the Longhouse. The significance of this is not just lost there in 1869. Later on in the 1800s, and there's a flag hanging at the Cultural Center Museum in Brantford that shows a Commonwealth flag, because Queen Victoria accepted Indigenous people as full members of the British Commonwealth. And then in 1913, Arthur came back to Six Nations. And at that time he was given the condolence ceremony again because his mother had died since he'd been there before. The difference between 1869 and 1913 is now that Arthur was the Governor General of Canada. And in 1919, his cousin, Edward, came to Brantford because now you've got a rafter that is braced to the other rafters, but we need to brace that rafter, and so that rafter needs a chief. So they conferred on Edward the name Teohosea, and Edward, who became King Edward of England, was the chief for the Canadian rafter to talk to the other chiefs. So there might only be 2,000 Abenakis, but they also have one voice. There might be 37 million Canadians, such as there are today, but they also only have one voice. Each of the rafters have a democratic voice in that Longhouse and the affairs that govern our relations over that time. And having talked with and teaching that to the gathering there, those folks who were called settlers, I asked them, I said, you know, one of the conditions about coming into our Longhouse was this, that you honor our land, you honor the river, you honor everything that lives in this environment. That's why we tell you about our our greeting to the living world, or to the awareness of it all. And this river is a symbol of that vitality that we have said that it's your duty and responsibility to become indigenous to this land. And the only question I can ask them, and I did ask them, and I ask everybody this, including my students, is you were given a duty and responsibility to become indigenous to this land. The only question I can ask is, have you? Two prime ministers in a row, actually, Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau, said we haven't done a very good job with our indigenous people, not our indigenous people, but with indigenous people. And that the question I then extend is, over the years, we've been treated pretty miserably by our cousins. And so we take opportunities like the Turo on the Grand to say, I don't know if I can call you settlers anymore. I think that you were given a responsibility to become indigenous to this land. All I ask is that you prove it. So let's go paddle the Grand River together. An important part of Ongwehueneha and Haudenosaunee history is the idea that place names are actually, they tell a story. From Ticonderoga, Ganajahariga, Saratoga, all the way over here. And when we are on the two-row paddle, we remind people that the names tell a story. For example, Caledonia. Caledonia is a translation or a transformation of the Cayuga word for that, which was Craidoda. So the natives must have been saying Caledonia when they'd say Craidoda. So Craidoda, what it means is the same as Mohawk, Geoquiroda, where the trees are. So there's an important part of our geography on the two-row that has to do with how the names tell a story. Chiganadahede is the name for Brantford, which means the town on the hill, between the hills, and you can see it from Tootelo Heights on that side over to where the General Hospital is on that side, the hills there, in the town that was in the middle. The river's name, the original name, is Os. And Os refers to the trees that are along there. And as I was paddling down the river, I noticed that there's so many willow trees. And Os means willow. And Oswego, which is how you would say the village here, they say it Schwiegen these days, Oswego, but it actually is Oswego, which is the same word as Oswego, New York, which means where the willows are around. And as we think about those things, we come to celebrate the diversity of the Wishkahunawitjage, the Five Nations, or the Haudenosaunee. Haudenosaunee, many built the house, which is the relationship that we see with each other as we're all members of one long house among the Five Nations. We celebrate the way the culture has been passed down through the generations and come to the realization that we still are who we are. Despite everything that happened, we're still who we are. And so who are we? Back in the ancient times, back a long time ago, when we were over in the Mohawk River and the Hudson River area, the Mohawks were people of the river. We were the protectors of the eastern door. We would get in our canoes. We were all up and down that area from way up by Ganawage near Montreal, all the way down into the Albany area and so on. That was the Mohawks, protectors of the eastern door. Protectors of the western door with the Cattaraugus River and all of the rivers on this side were the Senecas. And to this very day, we're still the same people. We are still on a river. And what did that mean? So whenever there are events that happen where there are disputes or conflicts that happen, you find that who's out there? Mohawks and Senecas. But a part of the celebration also recognizes that the Cayugas lived near their lake, near Ithaca, New York. The Onondagas near Syracuse. And the Oneidas at Oneida Lake down by Standing Stone by Oneida, New York. And they're still the same people today, taking care of the home fires while the east and western door look after things. So as I was going down the river and seeing all of that, I was imagining years ago with the Oyo Kondo or the Rodisko Haget, the warriors, that's a loose translation, and their journeys up that river. And I was thinking of that, especially up the other side of Brantford, up the other side of Paris, where it's very shallow and we had to get out in portage. I was thinking as I was stumbling around on the rocks, I wonder if my ancestors stumbled around on the rocks the way I am. What a an excuse I am for the old warriors who probably had no problem going through these areas on their journeys up and down that river and so on. And thinking now how much we have lost, but remembering that we're still who we are. We're still on our river, and we still enjoy the two-row paddle down the Oswego or the Osa River. That's what I think about sometimes when I go on the journey here, about the connection of that water back through the time and space of our history, because all water connects to all water everywhere, and that's water is in our blood, and it's part of who we are.